This lecture, this video picks up on the part of the lecture on Locke that was missing. The recording device shut down. So there is a small part, won't be a very long video, but it's a small part of the lecture that was missing between the moment the video went down and the moment we picked it up at the next video that is posted on online. If you recall from the previous lecture, um, the way I was trying to unpack Locke's argument is there's two steps. The first step is him trying to prove that something like private property must be admitted, must be allowed. And in short, Locke's argument is that private property are ultimately rights of exclusion, excluding other people from objects, goods, resources. Things like land, apples, acorns, animals perhaps, things like that. Now, why must that be allowed? Well, Locke says God wants us to use the world fruitfully or productively, to use the world, and we can only really use the world fruitfully, productively, and so on, if we are allowed to exclude others from certain parts of it. One way that Locke tries to prove this is by showing that at the limit for things to be useful to you, there's at least one version in which, one kind of use, where it's absolutely necessary that you're allowed to exclude people from. And that's the case where you eat something, digest it, and then it nourishes you, as he puts it. Nourishing just means sort of like it gets absorbed into, like, your body takes it within itself, right? So you eat an apple, the apple goes into your stomach, the stomach digests it, it gets put into your bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream it goes into, at some point it becomes like, say, muscle fiber. The point that it is muscle fiber when you've been nourished by it, at that point, Locke thinks, well, you do have a right over your own body, your own person. We all agree with that. But now the apple just is your body. And so if you have a right over your person, then you also have a right over that part of the apple that has become your person. And then Locke starts to work his way back. He says, well, if you accept that there's these cases in which the rights over the apple can be excludable, then maybe there are other cases that are relevantly similar, where we can also have rights over apples, acorns, and so on, objects, such that we can exclude others from them. Now, Locke gives a couple of arguments for why we should think this, and this is step two. It's particular what's become called the labor theory. And the labor theory is just that Locke says, what things can you exclude other people from? Well, it's those things with which you mix your labor, or those things upon which you labor. And there seem to be different versions or different varieties of the argument here. The first is the one that got discussed in the previous video or the lecture, which is Locke seems to say, quite literally, you mix your labor with something that is unowned, and that's why you become the owner. So it's one thing to say, step one of the argument, hey, you must become an owner. It must be possible. It's not that you must become an owner. It must be possible for people to become owners. Then step two, you have to say, well, how do they, if it is possible? How do they become owners? And so step two is the labor theory. And one possible answer is to say, well, how do they become owners? Well, if there's something that is unowned and you mix your labor with it and you own your labor, then that thing becomes owned by you. In the video you'll see right before it breaks out, I'm talking about like the literal infusion of ownership into the object. And so that's the key premise here that's on this slide that you're looking at right now, this number 5. So like, if you mix something that you own with something that is unowned, you thereby come to own it. At least, Locke says, when there's enough and is good left in common for others. And that's a qualification that we'll get to at the end of this video and at the beginning of the next. That's already online. All right, so the idea that mixing something you own with something that is unowned would create ownership is very controversial. You'll have read Waldron. Waldron objects to this, and Waldron says, look, that makes no sense because mixing labor is It's a metaphor at best. You can't really mix labor. Labor is not a substance to be mixed. Labor is an activity, and you can't mix an activity with a substance, not literally anyway. But if it's a metaphor, well, then we haven't really gotten an answer yet, right? Because the metaphor stands for something else, and then that's the thing we're looking for. So that's one objection. The other objection is the one that Nozick himself offers. Nozick says, actually, this is way too strong. It's not true, generally speaking, that if you mix something you own with something that is unowned, you thereby come to own the unowned thing. Sometimes the reverse happens. It's not that you become the owner of the unowned, it's that you lose ownership of the owned. The example that Nozick gives is the can of tomato juice. So suppose I own a can of tomato juice, which I own, right? Then here's the ocean, which I don't own. I pour the can of tomato juice into the ocean. What happens? Do I gain an ocean or do I lose a can? And Nozick thinks it's obvious you lose the can, right? Well, if that's true, then this 5 is false, right? Here is a counterexample. Because you've mixed something that you own, tomato juice, with something that's unowned, ocean. And the result is not that you become the owner of the ocean. The result instead is you lose your tomato juice. And that seems a pretty big worry. Any good theory of appropriation must allow that sometimes things that are owned can be lost, wasted, or spilled. And it doesn't really seem possible to appeal to the idea of mixing to distinguish between the cases where it's property rights conferring and where it's property rights losing. So those are some objections. Locke has something else to say in defense of this. And this argument doesn't exactly back up the mixing argument, but it is an argument for why the laboring activity, what he calls the mixing of your labor, should be considered as giving rise to ownership. And here's the ID. This is in section 28, and he extends it in 32. This is 28. Locke again appeals to this idea of the acorn or the apple that a person gathers, prepares, eats, digests, and then gets nourished by it. He says, well, at the limit, right, all the way at the end, when you are nourished by it, then you have appropriated it, which just means other people cannot use it anymore, morally speaking. They have to cut you open, and that's wrong. Okay, well, if that's true, then Locke says, well, let's think our way back. Well, is there a relevant difference between that, the moment that you've nourished it, and the moments that come before it? So to walk our way back through the timeline. So there's the nourishing, then there's the digesting, then there's the eating, then there's the preparing, like boiling it, then there is the gathering, the bringing it home, and then there's the actual acquisition, the picking it up and putting it in a basket or something like that. And then there is the just lying around, right? And Locke says, well, if you think that the nourishing point is, at the nourishing point, others cannot freely use the apple or the acorn anymore. Can they use it while you're digesting it? No, right? That wouldn't be a good point to say, well, you cannot when you're being nourished, but you can while it's in your stomach. Can it when you're eating it? No. Can you do it when you're boiling it, when you're just about to eat it? No, that's not in your body yet, but it would still be unfair to take it away from someone. How about when they're bringing it home? No. How about when they're acquiring it, picking it up? No. He says really the only relevant difference is not between nourishing and digesting, or between digesting and between eating and boiling, or between blah, blah, blah. The only relevant difference is between picking it up and it just lying around. That's where there is a sensible line to be drawn. So, second premise is that there is no relevant difference between all these activities, all the way from picking it up to being nourished. But here, this is just an implicit assumption. If there is no relevant difference between these two acts, A and B, and A constitutes appropriation, A being the nourishing, then B must also constitute appropriation. And so if you think that nourishing would be good enough to be a property owner, then you should also think that digesting, eating, boiling, bringing it home, and picking it up also are good enough to become a property owner. And so therefore here number 4, Locke says that is plain that if the first gathering made them not his, them being the acorn or the apple, right, nothing else could. That labor put a distinction between them and the common. So labor, which is in this case the picking it up, that's what makes the difference. The activity, the interaction of the person with the object. Okay, so that's 28. Section 28, Locke says, this is why you can see why the laboring, which earlier in 27 he calls mixing, but here it's just really sort of like the distinction between the common and the private. That is what he calls labor, and that is putting the difference between ownership and common ownership, private ownership and common ownership. And then he goes on in section 32, he says, well, let's generalize this theory. If you believe that this is true for apples and acorns, then there is no reason why this is not generally a good idea. There's nothing in particular about apples and acorns that's doing the work here. Generally speaking, it seems that labor, or the activity, the interaction of persons with unowned objects in some type of productive way, that is good enough to create ownership. And so then you have 6, here the final conclusion. You have a general theory of appropriation. In general, we can appropriate things through laboring. Okay. Those are the key sections in Locke's labor theory, Locke's theory of appropriation. Here's something I think that's worth emphasizing. Most people, almost everyone who discusses Locke, only talks about the labor mixing argument. But it looks like when you read closely, when you compare 27, which does contain the labor mixing argument, but you compare it with 28 and 32, which is the ones we just talked about, looks like there's two very different stories being told here. On the one hand, there is the labor mixing argument. It is the mixing of the owned with the unowned. It's an interesting theory. It's a highly creative, original theory. It does seem to have a certain intuitive appeal, but it's also really problematic. On the other hand, there's 28 and 32, where quite different stories being told. This is this line drawing argument, right? Like, well, if you accept that at the limit where we've been nourished by stuff, private property, namely exclusion, must be acceptable, then he works his way back and he says, well, where do we draw the line then, right? Is it just at the nourishing? That makes no sense. Is it just at the eating? That makes no sense, and so on. And he says, look, it's this kind of interaction. It's this activity where the person mixes, but metaphorically now mixes their labor with it. Because the mixing itself is not doing the activity, is not doing any work here in the argument. It's not because you mixed it. Rather, this is the point at which you interact in some productive way or in some particularly relevant way with the object. And that's what creates the property. And so that's why you get this quote here, acts of labor are the only sensible difference maker, meaning that the labor that was mine, so my activity, has fixed my property in them. It's like when he says has fixed my property in them, he's not literally talking about infusions anymore. He's talking about sort of like that assigns my claim to the object. It's much like the spirit is very similar, right? Like there is an activity that you engage in, and that activity belongs to you, and when that activity interacts with some external object, that makes the object become yours. But while in 27, he's saying that is because the activity sort of becomes part of the object, literally. In 28, he's not saying that. He's like, it fixes your claim onto it brings your claim to it. It's not the actual labor that gets infused, it's the right that gets attached. And so the second story doesn't say anything about mixing as such. It says something about what are good grounds for property acquisition. All right, so that's the labor theory that Locke gives. Remember, Locke has a couple of qualifications. The enough and is good, like one that we saw earlier, as Locke says, people can acquire things through laboring on them, at least as when there is enough and is good left for others in common. We'll get to that in a second. But there's other qualifications. In particular, there are qualifications about waste or spoiling, and Locke thinks that's not acceptable. So here's an objection that Locke considers where the spoiling thing becomes relevant. Locke asks in section 131, he says, you might be worried about this theory of mine that it allows for enormous inequalities. Does this not allow a person to engross as much as he will? So take everything that's around. And Locke sort of consistently goes through two types of scenarios. There's this sort of really sort of primitive scenario way back when in sort of caveman era or something, where there's no real developed society and property system. And then he considers sort of how that might develop into a society like ours. In the way back when, he says this is not a problem at all. May people engross as much as they want? No, he says. It's that state of nature that cannot, because there you can't really keep things, and you let them spoil. If you only can eat 10 apples and you bring home 20, 10 of those you'll eat, 10 of those will spoil. But spoiling things, letting things spoil, is waste, and waste is contrary to the law of nature, or God's will, or morality, or ethics in our more contemporary terms. Remember, for Locke, the law of nature, God's will, that is the whole foundation of property. God wants you to use the world productively, and that is why private property exclusion must be possible in the first place. Well, if that's true, if the whole idea, the whole purpose of this game is to have the world be used productively, then we cannot accept that people would take things, exclude others from them, and then just waste them. This is stuff that other people could have used productively, and God would have wanted that. Well, morality is in favor of that, endorses that. So no rights over things that that you take that are beyond what you can use, that waste, that spoil. And so in a state of nature where we're just sort of very, you can only eat that which you bring home to your cave and sort of can prepare. You can't really take a lot, because if you take much, quite quickly things will start wasting. Now today, so when we have a good, well-developed civil society, things are quite different. They're quite different because right now we are much better at collecting things without letting them waste. Especially today. Today we have refrigerators and freezers and so on, and so we can keep things without letting them waste a lot. Of course, we can pickle them, we can can them. There's all sorts of ways, right, that we can preserve foodstuffs. But it's actually even better, or worse, depending, I guess, how you look at it. But for Locke, even better. It says, in today's society, we've agreed to consider a little piece of yellow metal, we mean basically gold. We've agreed to consider that valuable. So way back when, all the stuff that was valuable were like cows, chickens, apples, acorns, roots, carrots, what have you, right? And that's the stuff that had value for us, because that was what we could use. But then as we developed, Locke says, we start considering these things like these pieces of metal that really don't have much use for us, but we start considering them valuable. And actually, in part, that is because they don't spoil. Right? These are fine metal, like gold doesn't rust. And so it doesn't spoil. And so gold, you can accumulate as much of as you want without running afoul of this waste or spoiling proviso or limitation. And so Locke is quite explicit about this. Inequality per se, or richness per se, doesn't really matter to him. He says the exceeding of the bounds of his just property do not lie in the largeness of his possession. So it doesn't matter how much you have. It lies in the perishing of anything uselessly in it. It's the useless part, not the large part. Of course, Locke wants this, right? Locke, think about the whole idea that the theory is about. The whole theory is about trying to encourage people to become more and more productive, use the world more and more fruitfully, encourage a kind of productivity and prosperity that we see in modern day society. And so you don't want to put a ceiling on how well off people might be, right? Like the richer we can get, the better in some ways. So Locke doesn't seem to be too concerned about inequality here, because, well, way back when it was impossible for large inequalities to be created because you just couldn't use it in time. But today you can without letting it waste, and the wasting is the problem, not the inequality per se. Okay, well, you might wonder if some person starts acquiring a lot, like almost everything maybe. What about the common claims of others? Initially, if you remember, the world was commonly owned by people, or at least open for the common use of people. So now we have people with very large possessions in civil society or something, or in the state of nature, perhaps. Would that be a problem? Well, not again in the state of nature in the way back when time. In part because of the spoilings proviso, but also in part because of this enough and is good proviso. So here Locke says, the appropriation of any, that should be, it says A, should be any parcel of land, by improving it was not any prejudice to any other man, since there was still enough and is good left. So in effect, there was nevertheless for others because of his enclosure for himself. So Locke is asserting, when there's not a lot of people around, if one person acquires a piece of land, is that a problem? No, because there's plenty of other pieces of land lying around. And so here he goes on in section 34. He says, look, that means you have to stay away from the other person's land because there's so much to go around. He that has good left for his improvement, so you can just work on your own piece of land because there it is. There's plenty of stuff lying around. As as good left for his improvement as was already taken up, needed not complain, ought not to meddle with what was already improved by another's labor. If he did, so the idea is if there is a lot of land lying around and you still try and I've cultivated this patch of land here, there's a lot of land out there for you to go and cultivate, and you come around and you start taking stuff from my land, then it's clear, he says, that he desired the benefits of another pain. So you desire the work that I'd done, which you had no right to, and not the ground. It's not land that you're after, because there's plenty of land out there. What you're after is the work that I did on the land, which made it so much more valuable. And that, my work, you have no right to, Locke says. And so here you can see the theme that Nozick is jumping onto, right? The theme being, when you take a person's property, you're really coming after their work, their selves, their persons, the things over which they have an absolute right to decide what happens with it. This is the sense in which Nozick thinks that taxation is like forced labor, because we're forcing people to use their labor on behalf of others, and not by their own will, not by their own choice. All right, so here you see the famous and often as good proviso, what Nozick calls the Lockean proviso. And again, here's no strict mixing argument. What Locke is saying here is, if you have some stuff and there's plenty to go around, then others cannot complain when you exclude them from what you have produced. Okay, this will be the last one before the other lecture picks up. So that's way back when. What about when we start transitioning to when there's not lots of stuff lying around anymore? What about people getting a lot of stuff then? Maybe through gold, maybe through what have you. Well, that's not really a problem either, says Locke, because when you appropriate land to yourself by labor, you do not lessen but increase the common stock of mankind. And the idea is here, won't read out the whole thing, but he says, look, imagine that you need 100 acres normally to feed yourself. You have to roam, hunt, gather, and so on. Not very efficient. If you now get 10 acres for yourself and you start planting things on it, you might be able to sustain yourself using just those 10 acres. But that means you have reduced your use. Like per capita use goes down. So per capita use goes down as a result of appropriation, which means for every person that appropriates, more stuff is available rather than less. So 90 acres become available because you don't need those anymore. You have enough to live on with your 10. And so Locke seems to suggest here a story about, well, even when the world gets more crowded, we can still appropriate, because even if there's not this sort of vast unknown part of the world out there anymore, appropriating will reduce our use, and that's leaving us good for others. The way that many people read Locke doesn't actually talk much about how how to extend this argument into the world that we have when there is just no commonly owned stuff anymore. So you couldn't even reduce your use because everything is owned already. I mean, he says that there is a couple of sections where he says some stuff about international agreements. It's a very strange argument. I didn't ask you to read it. The way that most Lockeans these days read this story is by saying the following. So, well, Locke here is suggesting that increased productivity can satisfy this enough and is good proviso. And so that will probably be true in our society too. In our society, it might be true that there is no longer commonly available things to be appropriated. But that doesn't mean there is no stuff around to be acquired. There's a lot of stuff to be owned, to be acquired. And so the Lockeans, the followers of Locke, say that will be good enough to satisfy the enough and is good proviso. Just because the living standards are going up so much, productivity has increased so much, we are so much better off than people were back then, and so you have no complaint against that system. That's definitely the way that Nozick reads him. Nozick says the proviso requires that people are made no worse off than they would have been had no appropriation occurred. And had no appropriation occurred, people would have been pretty badly off. Today, they're much better off because of the productivity increases that property systems create, and so that justifies the system. All right. Couple of notes. Locke clearly believes something like this, right? He keeps stressing. Well, here he says like you've reduced your land use from 100 to 10. And he says, well, I think this is very modest on my behalf. Probably the increase of productivity is much bigger than that. 9 out of 10 things, 9 out of 10 parts of value in the world is due to labor and productivity increases. Actually, maybe it's more like 99 out of 100. Maybe it's like 999 out of 1,000. He thinks basically everything is productivity increase. Finally, consider this is very similar to Hume's argument about the circumstances of justice. Right? Hume also thinks that the whole reason to have property is to increase productivity. Hume thinks that when we don't have property, people will not be able to use their stuff in ways that are productive or useful, and that's why we have to exclude others. The one big difference, of course, is that Locke seems to think that this happens against the background of abundance, where Hume thinks, no, this happens against the background where there is not enough to go around at all. But that's for our purposes, for this moment, not the biggest point. The main point is that they both do see the role of property as being the increasing of productivity, and that is part of what justifies it. All right, this gets us close enough to where the other lecture will pick up. So you can go to that next.